Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Capital Consumption Theory. I'm here today with Brian Winters and Austin Mackel, and we're going to talk about everything UBI politics, and UBI economics. Um, and I wanted to talk especially with you guys, with Austin and Brian. I wanted to talk to you guys about sort of the politics and the economics, the sort of the trend that we're on. One of the things that I'm interested in is, I'm a trader investor, so I'm always trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And one of the things that I've studied, like last year a little bit, was sort of the history of political change, sort of in the 1850s, when you had the shift of the parties, and how that tends to work out, because it seems like a lot of stuff is going on right now, and it's interesting to me that UBI, like for us, for UBI, we've had last year we've had Andrew Yang, and then Andrew Yang, but then Andrew Yang and sort of the Humanity Forward movement. Right now, it seems a little bit political homeless, and then you have like sort of the progressives and the MMT movement, and there's sort of right now, even though we're sort of I think the Humanity Forward group would say that we're sort of aligned, but my feeling is that progressives are sort of like they don't want us in their camp right now. That's my feeling.
Well, who cares? I mean, what a great camp to be in. No offense, like as a lifelong progressive, you're not missing much. It's if you're inside the tent, it's just as messy as it looks, right? It's worse than it looks from the outside. I think what's missing from politics, and this is where I break with a lot of my very lefty buddies, is that it's not that neoliberalism or anything is a particularly strong ideology. It's not that there's some huge conspiracy to crush and destroy progressive movements. It's that progressive movements don't have a great intellectual framework to frame their arguments. And I think a lot of that comes back to like European philosophers in the post-war era not being able to process the dual failures of socialism and of fascism and communism, and coming up and sort of abandoning a lot of the sort of core Enlightenment principles, right? That had been at the center of the progressive worldview. The progressive worldview used to mean let's make the world more rational, let's make the world more fair. Now we would say, yes, but what do you mean by rational? And just sort of stay in that sort of sophistic, that loop of sophistry of always, undermining the ability to sort of to put forward a framework. And I think it's also to do with social democracy failing to understand and adapt to the global picture. So you can look at something like the Brexit moment, and the UK had Corbyn as this new progressive champion. Along comes Brexit. He has no idea how to deal with it, and it destroys Corbynism more or less. And then and you've got the inverse of that is Bill Clinton embracing NAFTA. So he's like this progressive, except when he does global trade policy, it introduces all this free market stuff. So there's this like a bit of a void where the brain of the left should be, right? And I think that what's coming up when you combine some of the soft currency theories of post-Keynesian or MMT economics, I think people use MMT more broadly than they should, but just let's use that term, or post-Keynesian soft currency economics, which is saying, okay, we can probably spend more than we tax, right? That's actually not a terrible thing. It's what governments normally do. It might be the right idea. It might not be a problem. That and you combine that with the idea of a basic income, and then all of a sudden, I think you get a much more profound shift in the economic vision than people are realizing. And I think that there's this little nexus of thinkers, people like yourself. I was talking to Brian before we started recording about Jeff Crocker in the UK, Alex Howlett, who are all saying similar kinds of things. And I think that could be, that's where you could get the spark of a new sort of economic ideology, if you will, framed around consumption. And you call it what, capital consumption theory, right? And he calls it consumer monetary theory. And Crocker doesn't use those words, but he talks in his book, which I've got here, Basic Income and Sovereign Money, which is basically the two things, right? The two strands that I was just talking about. It's right there in the title.
Yeah.
He talks about consumption and the need to provide consumers with adequate spending money in a highly technologically advanced economy, all the way throughout that book. That's the question he's taking on. So
there's one thing that I really agree with MMT about, which is that we are sort of under running the productive capacity of the economy. In my view, Keynesianism sort of pushed over the idea that the market is self-regulating, but then later on they said, okay, the market is not self-regulating, and you don't get automatically enough aggregate demand. But they said that's only in the short term, and they said in the long term it's still self-regulating. But that's actually wrong.
Well, what Keynes would have said,
it's also not self-regulating. Yeah.
What Keynes would have said in the long term, we're all dead.
Ahead.
Sorry, I just
exactly. Exactly. Keynes just gave up the long term, but he really shouldn't have. You really need to extend the paradox of thrift, which has become a short-term idea, into the paradox of the worker consumer, which is that in the long run, if the consumers don't have money to spend, the entire economy is sort of stuck, and all of the investment, all of the capital, which should go to real investment, growing productive capacity, all of that capital just starts to go into speculative investments, because it cannot go into real investments because the consumer does not have money to buy the production.
And so this is the problem with the way that we currently create money, by creating it through debt and trying to offer really low interest rates that people will go ahead and borrow it into existence. And then they go out, the people who can afford to borrow large amounts of money are the people who already have money. And so they go out and spend it and drive up the assets. And instead, we need to turn that model around and create the money from the bottom up. Eddie, you talked about the politics back in the 19th century. And at the end of the 19th century, you had the People's Party, the original populists. And one of their big issues was expanding the money supply by including silver instead of just gold. And but that wasn't their only issue. They were thinkers. They recognized that the system was set up in a way that was screwing a lot of people over, and so they came up with a whole series of solutions, ways to address the problems that they saw in society. And although they weren't successful exactly in electing a majority or anything, their ideas trickled around in the political sphere, and a lot of them got picked up by the Democrats over the next 20, 30 years. And
what's really interesting is that, back during that time, because we were on the gold standard and money was a little bit deflationary, in that type of circumstance, like the wealthy would actually be much more willing to hold a lot of their wealth in currencies. And then, you start, kind of increasing the money supply through debt. And when we started doing that, around the Great Depression, that worked at first, because it helped, the case of the poor debtors, and gave them some relief. But, fast forward 80 years and, the entire economic system, all the businesses, all the wealthy, everyone has figured out that under this system that we're in now, debt is a really great thing to have. So all companies, all wealthy, pretty much anyone with any wealth is generally leveraged, and even the upper middle class with the real estate and the debt on that. So the debt has become. It used to be good for poor people. Now it's good for wealthy.
This is how like Jeff Bezos and all these other like super rich guys is they just borrow all their money so they don't have any income. With the understanding that they'll pay it back, when they die. And Yeah, they just avoid the income tax that way.
Amazon makes almost no money, but it's worth a great deal of money because money is free anyways. For corporations like that, they're worth money because they theoretically could make money
on
even
our
though they
public
don't.
infrastructure too.
And they can essentially. Well, I mean,
and then they don't pay taxes.
See, there's a broader picture here, right? Which is when people talk about Amazon, it's like, well, what Amazon is what the post office should have been, right? Like when the US invented the internet, they should have they should have hired they should have had a big spend and hired all these smart people from Silicon Valley and said, okay, now this is obviously some, going to relate to the post office. How's it going to relate to the post office? Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Let's be forward thinking. And they would have said, well, people could shop on their computer and we could deliver the product. And then, the post office should be doing what Amazon is doing, right? It should be a public service provided to all businesses. That's my take, right? Like same with Elon Musk, right? SpaceX shouldn't be doing that. Like the United Nations space program should be the thing that's taking us to Mars, right? And a lot of the time, it's not just a matter of them, but that's a separate picture. That would require a broader left-wing ideology, right? Which has more central planning involved, a global image of central planning to compete with the global marketplace that the neoliberalism has championed, right? And then then we wouldn't even be talking about these guys, and Elon Musk would be some mid-level engineer working at United Nations Space HQ on their Mars mission, right? That's my take on a lot of this stuff. That we've moved a lot of things into the market and away from the state that should be done by the state. Money creation is one of them, right? Money creation is the big one. And this thing where we've moved, like, no one wants profit, no one wants income, everyone just wants equity gains now, right? That's how you win at capitalism in 2021, is you have appreciation of your assets. And the number one thing driving that, I think, is the combination of technocratic interest rate setting at the Reserve Bank and then austerity politics by national governments. So the national government says we've got to balance the budget, which they don't have to do and they shouldn't do, but they say we've got to. They never do it, but they always make like they're trying to, right? And in doing that, they underspend. They spend in the wrong ways. They don't put money in the hands of consumers. They don't put money in the hands of workers. They don't put money in the hands of ordinary people. So when they don't do that, that forces the Reserve Bank to lower the interest rates and turn on the free money printer for the top end of town. That's when, Amazon can essentially print money by borrowing, because it's so, they have such access to credit that it's as if they have a free money faucet, right? But here's what the other question is, can it last though, or is that inherently going to create a boom and bust that damages even them, right?
So Austin, I actually, disagree with you in terms of state versus market. Like I'm very much not, a huge fan of the state, and I guess I differ from MMT in this way also. If I compare myself to MMT, we both think that there's, sort of unused capacity here. MMT wants to give it to the state to spend. I say it should go to the people and let them spend it on whatever they need.
I think Alex Howlett has a really graceful response here. He goes, well, first of all, we can all agree that some things should be done by the government and some things should be done by the market. And the basic income is to fund is part of the market side of that. It's giving people to buy stuff out of the market. It's more complicated because the state may enter the market. For example, like a state electricity company may be providing energy in the marketplace, right? So there's a little bit of a blur, but you can have that. We can agree on that overall framework and then argue specifically about what should be a state responsibility and what should be the market. For example, space travel.
I think it's fine when there's a consumer choice there, and the state, sets up, utilities, and maybe there's private utilities also, and everybody can just choose. Like I want the state-run one.
That's exactly it. When there's a consumer choice, there is no meaningful choice between power companies, right? All you want
Yeah.
is maximum energy at the minimum price.
Yeah.
There's no different flavors of electricity. And it's like the same with medical care, right? Like there's a right answer. If you need penicillin, you need to fucking take penicillin, not like homeopathic bullshit, right? Like some of these things, there's a right answer. The customer does not know best. And people just need to get what they need to get, you know?
Well, even worse though, is that giving the customer all these choices about which health plan do you want? What do you want your deductible to be? Who's your electric company? Giving them all these choices just consumes all their bandwidth. And then you can't, it makes it that much harder to focus on the other problems and other choices that you should be paying more attention to.
I agree about healthcare, and I agree because that it's more efficient, that the consumer, has a tough time really making it work for him. I also agree about public health. Masks, that should not be an option. That concerns the health of everyone, and it should be government mandated. Everybody just needs to wear a mask. That is just the way. That's just.
I can't sit with my bare, naked, unwashed, crusty ass on a public bus, right? Like, because that would be disgusting, and that wouldn't be an expression of my freedom. That would be me imposing and ruining other people's freedom to enjoy the bus, right? Same reason you can't get on a bus without a fucking mask, I think.
We were talking about deficit spending a while back, and I wanted to say that I'm actually. The plan that I'm in favor of is that the creation of money goes straight to the consumer as UBI. And after we do that, we should actually balance the budget. We should actually balance the budget and have the government run a balanced budget, but create enough money going to the consumer so that the economy
not counting UBI as part of the budget.
Not counting UBI as part of the budget, because it's different, because UBI is private consumption. It's the individual who gets to decide where that money goes.
At the moment, when they pay, I got $190 a couple of days ago as like our version of that child tax credit thing that you guys have got, right? Like we've had that for ages, and the government says you're a family with a child, your income is less than this. Here's $200 or whatever, right? I'm gonna go spend that on consumables, but that's still counted. I'm pretty sure that counts in the budget, right? So I mean, even though that's going to be when you spend money on hiring doctors for the public health system, they then take their wages, spend them into the market. So I mean, I think the distinction's a little bit artificial. I mean, and in terms of running a balanced budget, it seems like a bit of an arbitrary decision. Like, you may not want to do that, for example, if there's a war.
Right? Well, I think it's fine to have sort of short-term deficits, but that in the long run that they should actually even out. But you need to be creating enough money into the economy in the hands of consumers to make that sustainable. Otherwise, the way it's being done now, where new money only goes into debt, is not sustainable. And that's the reason why we are sort of leaning so hard on the fiscal policy lever, which was left over from Keynesianism. And we're just leaning on it as hard as we can, because we have no other option right now. And it's not good because it introduces. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we agree about what we want done. We just disagree about, like, I consider UBI
how you count it.
Private spending. You would count exactly. It's just a question of how you count.
It's how you count.
I think that UBI it's a good
In the Australian basic income movement, we have there's all these people arguing about negative income tax, UBI that's not taxable and then tax it back, UBI that is taxable and then tax some of it back.
They're pretty damn close.
Blah, blah, blah. And it's like all of you can actually achieve identical outcomes. Like, you can draw your income curve that you want and how much is being paid in taxes and how much money people have in their bank account, right? And you can achieve the same curve with multiple different administrative tools. So it becomes a question of actually what's the most administratively streamlined, which I think is tax-free UBI outside the game, and then catch it at the other end with progressive tax on earned income.
So Brian, I have a question about politics that I want to ask you. With what's going on right now with sort of Trumpism, with Trump losing in 2020, and Trumpism maybe hopefully looking like it's withering away a bit. And then, but with the Democratic, Party, where you have this split between sort of progressives and moderates, what do you see happening in the next 4 years? Like, I know you study a lot of political history, and from that, from your knowledge of what's happened in the past, what would your guess be about where we're going next politically?
Well, I can tell you what I would like to see. Whether or not it actually comes to pass, I don't know. But
Yeah.
America's at a time of a cyclical change. We go through a cycle about every 80 years, and we're at that point again. The pandemic, we can't go back to a pre-pandemic society. It's just, it can't happen. So the question is, what sort of political system comes out the other side? And I think there's an opportunity for a left-right coalition to seize the middle ground. The marginalized millions can seize control and kind of make the Republicans and Democrats. I mean, those guys have had 160 years to run things since the Civil War. It's time to let somebody else have a turn. And so my goal is to see the American Union grow as a block of swing voters and leverage those votes into passage of a legislative package that would include universal basic income of $300 a week and a bunch of other good policies.
You know how in the Civil War era, it was slavery eventually that kind of destroyed the system, made the system come falling apart. What issues do you see sort of driving evolution or devolution, in the current era?
I see
Is
the
UBI one of
issues
them?
that I see the issues that Martin Luther King identified: the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And the tens of millions of people who are living in poverty in this country, and we're patting ourselves on the back that we're only letting 7 million children go to sleep in poverty each night now, thanks to the tax credit. We should not be proud of that.
Yeah.
We should be ashamed that we allow that number to be so high. And and the racism that he identified is very obvious in our criminal justice system, and the fact that we have 2 million Americans waking up behind bars every single day. More than 80% of Americans recognize that the drug war has failed, and Republicans,
Right.
Democrats, Independents, but there's no political will to change it, to stop that. And so there's a demand for some common sense reforms to the criminal justice system. And then the militarism aspect as well, where the United States, well, this was the idea of Keynesian economics, was to have the government spend money, and somehow the military industrial complex kind of hijacked that idea of big spending. And so if we're going to spend through UBI and make sure consumers and citizens have enough that way, then we don't need all this military spending. And so we can address the last of King's evils by downsizing the military too.
So during the Civil War era, if I remember right, was it the Democrats and the Whigs before the Whigs were the ones before the Republicans?
There was a couple. There was the Know Nothings, and there was a bunch of parties that tried to coalesce.
But I think the major parties before the Civil War were Democrats and Whigs. And apparently at the time they were both non-ideological, and they actually tried to just stay away from issues. They were like patronage networks. They were just like, buddy, like we're all friends on our party. And then they tried to stay away from all the issues. But eventually, slavery became such a big issue that, you had to end up on one side or the other. And it was the Whig Party that lost the trust of the South because in terms of, allowing slavery to continue. So the South moved away from the Whig Party. They got destroyed. The Republican Party replaced it. And naturally became sort of the anti-slavery party out of the two. What would you see the mechanism potentially being in the current era? Like how might it work for things to change? How might the future work? Do you have any ideas?
Yes, my idea is to crowdsource functional government. Right back in the 1800s, you had to send people physically to Washington to work out all these deals and work out the details of how any of these proposals would work. But in the 21st century, we don't all have to be in the same room in the same city. We can collaborate all across the country. And so when
we can do it all on Zoom,
we can. Or
I mean, that
Reddit,
happened,
or,
didn't it?
you know,
Didn't you guys? There was like high courts, high court sitting via Zoom, and Supreme Courts, rather, you guys have in Australia. It's the High Court is the top one.
Yeah.
So we clearly we can. I remember there was I can't remember what it was, but it was like a Zoom court, a Zoom meeting of Supreme Court judges deciding that like teachers couldn't teach by Zoom or something obscene like that happened at an early stage in the pandemic. I remember reading about it. Everyone Google it yourself and make sure I'm not getting the story wrong. But can I do you mind? It was kind of moving on to a theory of change discussion rather than what is the right policy. It's about how do we actually get that policy into place, right?
Yes,
and
right.
this is my preoccupation. I in 2011 was the big year for me where I was really optimistic about progressive change. I was in Cairo for parts of the Arab Spring, and there was the Occupy movement, and this friend of mine wrote a letter from Cairo that ended up being read by Tom Morello at the Wisconsin State House when that was seized, and then Michael Moore was there, and there was this big David Graeber was hanging out at Occupy Wall Street, and there was this big feeling like, all right, change is gonna come. And I remember at the time sort of writing a proposal for something like what Brian was saying, like that the movement should organize itself like that the movement should come up with an online system so that we could organize ourselves without defaulting to the same big hierarchical traditional top-down party structures. And it didn't happen then, and I don't think it'll happen now. And I think the first thing that needs to change is the media, and that's what I do in my day job, is try and drive change in the media. And that I think is like nothing will, and what I don't mean is set up an alternative media who are different people, right, and have different politics. And I mean, we actually have to change the way that media is produced and consumed at the level of process, right? Like as we want to change democratic process, we have to, I think the first place to think is actually change media process. Which is how we get there, which is what I was going to start up that's in the media space, creating a product for journalists so that they can track their research process, so that we can start to have this quality signal that identifies the journalists who are doing research and have an evidence-based approach, and that you have to earn that quality signal by actually recording what you're doing, like Twitch for journalists.
So right? How do you see that would actually change the political process? You think that politicians would suddenly be like, oh, I can't dispute these facts, and then they would all just fall into line behind common sense proposals?
Everything changes at the margins, right? So some stories would not get published that get published. So a lot, and if this became the norm, then 80% of stories would not be published, because most stories are just repetitions of someone else's story, right? So if I'm a journalist and I spend 2 weeks, and this happens all the time, 2 weeks researching a story, and it's amazing, and it's a worldwide story, the company loses money. You know who makes money? All the other people who waited for me to hit publish, then copy pasted it. So if we could drive all of those eyeballs towards the investigator, then there would be more scrutiny on politicians, right? Because there would be more journalists actually doing the digging, and fewer sitting on Twitter waiting for somebody else to do it so they can put a clickbait headline on it and eat someone else's lunch, right? And then if you're a journalist, you have to eat everybody else's lunch because everyone's eating yours. So if you get to do a little bit of research, it's because that's what you like. You fight the system to get a few hours to actually check.
How would that change the political system, though?
Oh man, I mean, the media is where we build the consensus and where consensus becomes visible. So a lot of the policies you're supporting, right? They are really popular policies, I'm sure. Like, in fact, in Australia, we did polling shows UBI has majority support. Some of that polling is not as good as it should be. I'm actually about to write a blog about it. But but there is polling that shows that, you know, there's an overwhelming many more people are for it than against it, but it's nowhere in politics. It's considered a political impossibility, and one of the reasons for that is that no one in the media talks about it, right? That it doesn't get much media coverage. So even when there is a public, and most people therefore who support the idea believe that they're isolated, and most of the people who would support your ideas would believe, a lot of them anyhow, will believe I agree with all this, but everybody else is on board with the current system. So dissent becomes invisible, and consensus becomes invisible, and facts become invisible, and then we wonder why we're not making, you know, well-informed choices.
Well, I like your optimism, I guess, but I don't think that the major parties will shift just because the media gets better.
Oh, I mean, look, well, maybe they'll become redundant, but like, we can't do anything in this process where, like, right now we're arguing whether people should take vaccines, you know, right? Like, this is a disabling crisis. And like this idea, when we're talking about deficits, right? Like, when you say to people, well, deficits are normal, they look at you like you're crazy, right? But it is an establishable empirical fact that the vast majority of developed countries run deficits most years. And, you know, the bill doesn't actually come due the way that people think it does.
Because it's,
right?
It's not a bill, right? That deficit, that's the profit from the system.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The economy, that's the profit that you get to spend extra money that you didn't have before.
Yeah. So everyone thinks that when the government spends money, the country is losing money. But when the government spends money, the country is gaining money. And like, we're a long way from convincing people of that, of getting a clear picture of that into the public domain. We can't even get people to wear masks and take a vaccine. So you see, how are you going to build a movement? How are you going to organize something in this what I'd call information chaos? Right? Like, we're in this state of information chaos where you're bombarded with claims and it's impossible to sort between them. And there's a million different petitions to sign, and everybody's, you know, shouting in the stadium. We're all in a stadium and everybody's shouting their opinions into this stadium full of everybody else. And it's not how you have a productive conversation. And I think
yeah,
that's my theory anyhow.
I do think that media is pretty important. It does. I think it does shape sort of the worldview in society, and politicians, you know, they do, you know, at some point, you know, have to take that into account, I think.
Like, Trump didn't care about anything, but he cared what they were saying on Fox News. You know, right?
Yeah.
Sure. So
that's the master. Fox.
All right. Anybody
Fox
have any final thoughts? Are we at a good stopping point? I think so. Optimistic that change has to come at some point, that we can't just keep maintaining the status quo.
Right on. I think Eddie's frozen in agreement.
Yeah.
Good discussion, guys. See everybody back in 2 weeks from now.
All right. Catch you then.
All right.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Brian.